Why should anyone want to hear his side of the story? That was the question put directly to Scott Peterson, and his answer was simple. If he had a chance to get the reality out there, he had a chance to show people what the truth was. And if they were willing to accept it, maybe that would take a little bit of hurt off his family. That answer has been sitting in the public record ever since he gave it. And it sits there alongside everything else that is in the public record. The jury's verdict, the sentence, the conviction that was never overturned, the remains recovered from the exact waters where he told police he spent Christmas morning alone. This is not a story about whether Scott Peterson is guilty. 12 jurors answered that question unanimously in November 2004, and no court has touched that answer since. This is a story about what happened after, about what 20 years inside the California prison system looks like for one of the most recognized convicted murderers in American history, about the transfer that changed his daily existence, about the Sunday morning in March 2025 when a fellow inmate attacked him in a recreation yard, and about the 4 words that inmate used to explain why. Those 4 words are where this story is going. But to understand them, you need to understand everything that came before them, and that means starting at the beginning. If this is the kind of detailed, documented true crime coverage you have been looking for, take 5 seconds right now and subscribe to DAV Crime Records. Hit the like button before we go any further, because this story only gets more layered from here, and you do not want to miss a single moment of it. Lacey Ann Peterson was 27 years old on the morning she disappeared. She was 8 months pregnant with her first child, a son she and her husband had already named Connor. They had bought a house on Covina Avenue in Modesto, California. They had set up a nursery. They had chosen a name and built a picture of what the next chapter of their lives was going to look like. By every outward measure, they were a young couple standing at the edge of something good, a family that was about to begin. Friends and family who knew Lacey described her as someone who filled every room she walked into. She baked, she gardened, she laughed easily, and gave herself fully to the people around her. She had grown up in Modesto in a close family anchored by her mother, Sharon Rocha. She had studied ornamental horticulture at California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo, where she met Scott Peterson in 1994. They married in August 1997. By December 2002, the life they had constructed together, from the outside, appeared to be exactly on track. On Christmas Eve morning, that life ended. Scott Peterson later told police he had left the house at approximately 9:30 in the morning to drive to the Berkeley Marina, roughly 90 miles from Modesto, to go fishing. He said he had gone alone. He said he had spent the day on the water in cold conditions with no companions and no witnesses. When he returned to Covina Avenue that afternoon, the family's golden retriever, Mackenzie, was wandering the backyard with his leash still attached. Lacey was not inside the house. Scott called his mother-in-law, Sharon Rocha, to ask if Lacey was with her. She was not. Police were contacted at approximately 5:48 in the evening on December 24, 2002. What started as a missing person case in a mid-sized California city became, within days, one of the most intensely watched criminal investigations the country had ever seen. The media descended on Modesto almost immediately. Candlelight vigils drew hundreds of people into the streets. Lacey's photograph, a young woman smiling and visibly pregnant, appeared on television screens from coast to coast. Her family made public pleas for information. Sharon Rocha stood at press conferences in a state of barely contained devastation, appealing to anyone who knew anything to come forward. Beside the family during those early appearances stood Scott Peterson. He was composed in a manner that people watching at home registered and struggled to name. It did not read as grief. It read as something else. People noticed, even if they could not agree on exactly what they were seeing. Investigators noticed too, and they were already moving. The investigation did not move slowly, and it did not move in Scott Peterson's direction. In January 2003, investigators publicly revealed that Scott had been carrying on an extramarital affair with a woman named Amber Frey, a massage therapist from Fresno. He had met her on November 20th, 2002, approximately 1 month before Lacey disappeared. From the moment he met Amber Frey, Scott Peterson told her he was not married. As their relationship developed through November and into December, he went further than simply hiding his marriage. He told Amber Frey that his wife had died. He presented himself as a widower, a man who had experienced a significant loss and was carefully beginning to move forward. Amber Frey had no reason to question him. She had no knowledge of a pregnant wife living on Covina Avenue. She had no way of knowing that the man describing his grief to her had a family that was very much alive, at least for the time being. When she saw Scott Peterson's face on the news as the husband of a missing pregnant woman and heard him make public appeals for his wife's return, she contacted Modesto police immediately. She did not hesitate. She did not negotiate. She cooperated fully from the moment she came forward, and she agreed to allow investigators to record her ongoing telephone calls with Scott throughout the entire active search for Lacey. Those recordings would become some of the most consequential evidence in the trial that followed. One of those recorded calls was placed on New Year's Eve, December 31st, 2002. A candlelight vigil for Lacey Peterson was being held in Modesto that same evening, just miles from the house on Covina Avenue where the couple had lived. On that call, Scott Peterson told Amber Frey he was calling from Paris. He described the celebrations surrounding him in vivid detail. He painted a picture of himself standing in a European city, watching the new year arrive, surrounded by crowds and fireworks, with no apparent awareness of or connection to the anguished search taking place back home. He was not in Paris. He had not left California. The call was traced to a location consistent with the Modesto area. He described a European celebration in elaborate detail to a woman who was recording every word for the police investigation into his wife's disappearance. And none of it was true. The boat was another piece of what was assembling itself around Scott Peterson. In late November 2002, just weeks before Christmas Eve, he had purchased a 14-foot aluminum fishing vessel. He told almost no one about it, including Lacey's family. The boat had no apparent history of regular use. It had been purchased quietly, kept quiet, and according to Scott's own account, taken out for the first time on Christmas morning, when he drove it 90 miles to the Berkeley Marina and spent the day fishing alone in cold conditions, with no companions, no witnesses, and nothing to show for the hours he said he was on the water. 4 months after Lacey vanished, her remains and Connor's remains were recovered from the shoreline of San Francisco Bay, not from a distant or unrelated stretch of coastline, from the eastern shore near Richmond, California, within miles of the Berkeley Marina. The exact location where Scott Peterson had told police he spent Christmas morning fishing alone. Investigators had been developing a theory since January. The recovery of the remains, in those particular waters, at that particular proximity to where Scott said he had been, confirmed it for them. The connection between his stated alibi and the location where his wife and son were found was not interpreted as coincidence. It was understood as the physical documentation of what had happened. Connor's remains were recovered on April 13, 2003. Lacey's remains were recovered the following day, April 14th. On April 18, 2003, Scott Peterson was arrested at the Torrey Pines Golf Course in La Jolla, California, approximately 500 miles from Modesto. The details of that arrest were reported extensively and have remained part of the documented public record ever since. His hair had been dyed blonde, a significant departure from his natural dark brown. He was carrying approximately $15,000 in cash. He had his brother's identification on his person. He had multiple cell phones. He had camping equipment and survival supplies. Prosecutors would later characterize that combination of circumstances as the profile of a man who had decided he was not coming back. Scott Peterson said he had been going to play golf. The trial opened in Redwood City, California, in June 2004. The venue had been moved from Stanislaus County because the level of pre-trial publicity in Modesto made selecting an impartial jury there a practical impossibility. The proceedings ran for nearly 6 months and generated the kind of sustained national media coverage that belongs, in the modern era, to only a small number of criminal cases. The prosecution built its case entirely on circumstantial evidence. There was no murder weapon recovered. There was no confession. There was no direct forensic evidence that documented the act of killing or conclusively placed Scott Peterson at a specific location where a killing occurred. What prosecutors assembled instead was something more cumulative. They built a portrait, detail by detail, of a man with documented reason to want his wife gone, documented opportunity to act on that reason, and behavior in the aftermath that was consistent, point by point, with someone who already knew precisely what had happened to her. The affair with Amber Frey was central to that portrait, not simply because it established that Scott had been unfaithful, but because of the specific architecture of lies he had constructed around it. He had told this woman, while his pregnant wife was alive and living under the same roof, that his wife was dead. He had invented an identity as a grieving widower ready to begin again. That was not ordinary infidelity. That was a fabricated version of reality, built on the assumption that the lie would hold permanently, which required a specific set of circumstances to remain true. The boat added another layer, purchased secretly in late November, used apparently once, on Christmas morning, for a solo trip to the exact stretch of water where Lacey and Connor's remains would later be found. His behavior in the weeks following Lacey's disappearance was documented through testimony and records. He had fielded inquiries about renting the house. He had taken steps toward selling Lacey's car. His emotional presentation, observed by family members, investigators, and members of the public who watched his televised appearances, was consistently described as falling outside what anyone around him expected from a husband whose 8 months pregnant wife had vanished without explanation. Those observations were subjective, but they were consistent, and they became part of the portrait the prosecution placed before the jury. The defense maintained that the circumstantial evidence was insufficient to support a murder conviction. Scott Peterson maintained his innocence throughout the trial and has continued to maintain it in every public statement he has made since. The defense raised the possibility that Lacey had been abducted by a third party and proposed alternative explanations for the physical evidence, including tidal and current patterns that could account for the location where the remains were recovered. The jury heard all of it. The jury deliberated for 7 days. During those deliberations, 2 jurors were removed and replaced by alternates, including the original foreperson. The circumstances of those removals generated significant controversy and became a central focus of subsequent appeals. On November 12, 2004, the jury returned its verdicts. First-degree murder of Lacey Peterson. Second-degree murder of Connor Peterson. The crowd gathered outside the Redwood City Courthouse responded with an eruption that witnesses described as the release of pressure accumulated across nearly 2 years of investigation, arrest, and trial. Cheering, crying, a collective exhale from people who had been watching since December 2002. One juror, speaking to reporters outside the building, said that San Quentin was Scott Peterson's new home. She said it with a clarity that left no room for ambiguity about how the jury had arrived at its conclusion. In March 2005, Superior Court Judge Alfred DeLucchi formally sentenced Scott Peterson to death. He was transferred to San Quentin State Prison shortly thereafter. San Quentin sits on a peninsula in Marin County with a geography that carries its own particular weight in the context of this case. It overlooks San Francisco Bay, the same San Francisco Bay where Lacey and Connor's remains had been recovered. The same waters Scott Peterson had said he spent Christmas morning fishing. He would now live within sight of them, indefinitely. Death row at San Quentin was not designed for gradual adjustment or incremental diminishment. It was designed for total containment. The cells measured approximately 4 feet by 10 feet. A cot, a toilet, limited personal possessions, whatever the facility permitted. Condemned men were allowed out of those cells for a few hours each day, sometimes less. Every movement through every corridor happened in handcuffs, not selectively. Not in response to specific behavior or individual threat assessment, universally. The rule applied to every condemned man, every time, without exception. The institutional architecture of condemned housing was built on a principle of absolute separation. When condemned men moved through the corridors and walkways of San Quentin, general population inmates were required to face the wall. Not because the condemned men were assessed as posing a greater individual threat than anyone else in the building, but because the design of the system demanded it. Condemned men did not share dining halls with general population inmates. They did not share yards. They did not have access to the same programming, the same services, or the same communal spaces. They existed in a parallel operational layer of the facility, visible to the institution, sealed off from its living interior. California had not executed anyone since 2006. Men on condemned row were waiting for a death the state kept indefinitely suspending. Some documented accounts described condemned men abandoning their appeals after years in those conditions, not because their legal arguments had been exhausted, not because they had accepted any finding of guilt, but because the daily reality of existing in that narrow, controlled, unchanging space, cut off from meaningful human contact, waiting for an execution date that kept moving further away in a state that had effectively ceased carrying out executions, had become something they could no longer sustain. For some of them, according to those accounts, the execution had come to represent the only available exit, and California kept declining to schedule it. Scott Peterson waited in those conditions for more than 15 years. In August 2020, the California Supreme Court overturned his death sentence. The court was explicit and precise about what had changed and what had not. The conviction itself, the guilty verdicts on both counts of murder returned by the jury in November 2004, was untouched. The finding of guilt remained exactly where it had always been. What the court addressed was the sentence, and specifically, a procedural error made during jury selection 16 years earlier. Potential jurors who had expressed general philosophical opposition to the death penalty had been improperly dismissed before the trial began. The court found that those dismissals had contaminated the penalty phase of the proceedings, potentially denying Scott Peterson an impartial jury on the specific question of punishment. The error had first been raised in an appeal filed in 2012, 8 years into Peterson's time on death row. Following the court's decision, the state of California consulted with Lacey's family. Sharon Rocha and the family said publicly that repeating the penalty phase process was too painful to go through again. The state announced it would not seek to reinstate the death penalty. On December 8, 2021, Scott Peterson appeared in a San Mateo County courtroom for formal resentencing. Sharon Rocha stood in that room and faced him. She told him she had seen no sorrow and no remorse from him across 19 years. She told him that whatever any court decided going forward, 2 things would remain permanently fixed. Lacey and Connor would always be dead, and he would always be their murderer. Lacey's sister, Amy Rocha, spoke through tears and told Peterson directly that being in the same room with him made her sick. Peterson sat without speaking. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There would be no parole hearings, no dates circled on a calendar, no mechanism by which he might one day make a case for release. Life without parole in California does not carry a horizon. It does not contain a future moment at which the debt is considered settled. It ends the way it ends, when the person serving it stops breathing. In October 2022, Scott Peterson was transferred from San Quentin to Mule Creek State Prison in Ione, California, a medium to high security facility approximately 40 miles southeast of Sacramento. His attorney described the move to reporters with a phrase worth examining carefully. He said Peterson would have more of a normal prison life. That word, normal, carries enormous weight in that sentence, because what Peterson was leaving at San Quentin and what he was arriving at in Mule Creek are not simply different facilities with different amenities. They represent fundamentally different conditions of daily existence. At San Quentin, condemned housing had enforced near total isolation from every other person in the facility. At Mule Creek, general population means shared dining halls, shared recreation yards, shared corridors, and daily proximity to men who have been living inside that system long enough to know exactly who just walked in. Mule Creek State Prison does not house anonymous men. Among the documented high-profile inmates housed there is John Albert Gardner, convicted of the murders of 2 teenage girls in San Diego County. The men inside Mule Creek are serving the longest sentences the California prison system imposes. When Scott Peterson arrived in October 2022, he was not walking into a place where his name meant nothing. He was walking into a place where virtually every man on every yard had spent years watching his case unfold on television, forming views about it, and arriving at conclusions about what kind of man he was. The Lacey Peterson case is one of the most recognized criminal cases in American history from the early 21st century. A young pregnant woman vanishing on Christmas Eve, a husband who had told his girlfriend his wife was already dead, remains recovered from the exact waters where he claimed to be fishing that morning. 6 months of national trial coverage. A verdict that landed with the force of everything the case had built toward. Every man inside Mule Creek, regardless of when he arrived or what brought him there, knows who Scott Peterson is. Proximity, for a man carrying that history and that conviction, is not a neutral condition. It carries weight. It carries consequences. On Sunday, March 9, 2025, Scott Peterson was in the recreation yard at Mule Creek State Prison, playing pickleball. And that morning, a fellow inmate attacked him. The 4 words that attacker used to explain what happened say everything about what it means to be Scott Peterson inside a California state prison in 2026. Those 4 words, and everything that followed that Sunday morning, are exactly where this story is heading next. Scott Peterson was holding a pickleball paddle when the attack came. The recreation yard at Mule Creek State Prison is not optional space for the men who live there. It is one of the only places inside a California correctional facility where time moves at a different pace, where a morning can be organized around movement rather than the slow and repetitive counting of hours. Men serving sentences measured in decades do not treat yard time as a casual amenity. They treat it as a structure, something to build a day around, something that makes the day feel like it has a shape. On Sunday, March 9, 2025, Scott Peterson was on that yard, doing exactly what hundreds of other inmates across California's prison system do on Sunday mornings. He was playing pickleball. A ball broke loose across the court. He ran after it, paddle in hand, moving at speed across the recreation path. A fellow inmate named Charles R. Miles was walking that same path at that same moment. Miles looked up. He saw a figure coming toward him fast, carrying something raised in his hand. The calculation that followed was not slow, and it was not considered. It was the kind of calculation that more than a decade inside the California prison system had made automatic. Charles Miles was 39 years old. He had been inside the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation since 2011, when a jury convicted him of gang-related murder and a judge sentenced him to 58 years to life. He had spent more than a decade learning how prison yards operated, how men moved through them, and what certain kinds of movement meant in that environment. When he saw a figure approaching at speed with something raised, he did not stop to gather more information. He reacted. He attacked. What the figure in front of him actually had in his hand was a pickleball paddle. The California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation confirmed the incident through spokesperson Todd Javernick. The official statement documented the following. On March 9, 2025, incarcerated person Charles R. Miles was walking on a recreation path at Mule Creek State Prison when he attacked incarcerated person Scott Peterson. Staff immediately responded using chemical agents and batons to stop the attack. Both Miles and Peterson were medically evaluated, determined to have sustained minor injuries, and were returned to their respective housing. Miles received a serious rule violation for the incident. That language, chemical agents and batons, deserves careful attention. Those tools are not deployed to separate two men exchanging words. They are not brought out for a brief physical exchange that has already wound down on its own. Chemical agents and the use of batons represent a direct, forceful intervention by correctional staff into a physical confrontation they determined required immediate action to prevent serious bodily harm. The California Department of Corrections confirmed in its own written statement that that level of response was required to stop what Charles Miles was doing to Scott Peterson on that recreation path. TMZ reported the story on March 11, 2025. Sources confirmed Peterson had been beaten. His injuries were not severe enough to require a hospital transfer. He was medically evaluated inside the facility, cleared by staff, and returned to his housing unit the same day. Beaten on a Sunday morning in the recreation yard of a California state prison. Back in his cell by Sunday evening. After the incident, Charles Miles gave a phone interview to the San Francisco Chronicle from inside the prison. He told the reporter what happened from his own perspective. He said he had not recognized Scott Peterson. He said that when he saw someone coming toward him carrying what appeared to be a weapon, he genuinely believed he was about to be attacked and responded accordingly. He described his reaction as instinctive rather than planned. The official record is consistent with that account. His rule violation was for use of force, not for premeditated assault on a specific target. The California Department of Corrections documented the event as a use-of-force incident on a recreation path, initiated by a case of mistaken identity that escalated before staff could intervene. The reporter asked Miles why he thought it happened. He answered in 4 words. It was God's plan. Sit with that for a moment. A man serving 58 years to life for murder, standing somewhere inside a California state prison, had just attacked Scott Peterson over a runaway pickleball. And when given the opportunity to explain it, he offered no apology, no extended reflection on what went wrong in those seconds, no commentary on who Peterson was or what he had been convicted of. Just 4 words, settled and complete. It was God's plan. Not that he wished the moment had unfolded differently. Not that he felt particular remorse about the man he had struck. Simply that a higher arrangement had placed Peterson on that path, with that paddle, running in that direction, and he had been the instrument through which the geometry of that Sunday morning was resolved. Those 4 words say something precise and important about the world Scott Peterson wakes up inside every day. Because Charles Miles, by his own documented account, did not even know who he was hitting. He attacked a man he did not recognize over a misread situation that lasted seconds. The men who do recognize Peterson, the men who have carried his face and his story in their memory for more than 20 years and have formed their own settled conclusions about what he deserves, are on the same yard. They were there before the attack. They were there after it. They are there now. There is an argument that is not made by Scott Peterson's legal team, not advanced by any innocence organization, but held by people who have spent significant time inside California's correctional system and by researchers who have studied its conditions in depth. The argument is this: life without parole in general population is, in certain measurable and non-trivial respects, harder to endure than death row. On death row at San Quentin, the isolation was total and structurally guaranteed. Peterson could not be approached by other inmates because other inmates could not physically reach him. The condemned housing unit functioned as a permanent, architecturally enforced separation from violence, from confrontation, from the entire spectrum of social friction that exists wherever human beings are compelled to share space under conditions they did not choose. That isolation carried its own specific weight. The loneliness was real. The monotony was real. The way it compressed time and stripped meaning from the hours was documented by those who studied condemned housing conditions in California. Those costs were genuine. But the isolation was also a wall. And a man behind a wall of that kind cannot be reached by the men standing on the other side of it. In general population at Mule Creek, that wall does not exist. Every morning, Scott Peterson opens his eyes in a building shared by hundreds of other men. Men who eat in the same dining hall. Men who move through the same corridors. Men who use the same recreation yard. Men who, unlike Charles Miles on that Sunday morning, know exactly who Scott Peterson is and have known it for more than 2 decades. There is no classification buffer between his name, his face, his conviction, and the daily awareness of every other man on that compound. There is no architectural protection separating his documented history from the people who carry that history with them into the yard every single day. And unlike men serving sentences with a parole eligibility date somewhere in the future, however distant, Peterson has no number to count toward. There is no hearing at which conduct gets weighed against conviction, no mechanism by which a future version of Scott Peterson could be assessed on any basis other than what a jury determined he did in 2002. Life without the possibility of parole is exactly what those words say it is. The only exit from Mule Creek State Prison available to Scott Peterson is death. He knows that. Every man on that yard knows that. And that knowledge does not lift. Not during yard time. Not during pickleball. Not at any point in any day. The argument that this condition is harder than death row is not a comfortable argument to make in the context of what this case is actually about. Lacey Peterson was 27 years old and 8 months pregnant. Connor Peterson never drew a breath outside the womb. Whatever the texture of Scott Peterson's daily existence inside Mule Creek, whatever it costs him to live that existence, it costs him while 2 people who never had the opportunity to live their lives at all are permanently gone. That fact does not shift under any legal argument, under any appellate ruling, under any reframing of the circumstances. It is fixed. And yet the question of what general population means for a man of his specific profile and conviction deserves to be examined clearly, because March 9th, 2025 is not simply a story about a prison altercation. It is a data point. It is one documented incident among the undocumented and ongoing daily reality of being Scott Peterson inside a California correctional facility. That incident happened on a Sunday morning, initiated by a man who did not even know who he was hitting. The men who do know are still on the same yard. They were there the day before. They will be there tomorrow. A Peterson family friend spoke to People magazine about his state of mind inside those walls. The source described a man keeping his spirits high, someone who held the attitude that he had not done anything wrong and was waiting for the day he could come out and perform what the source called his ha-ha dance, the moment he would tell the world he had been right all along. That is the image Scott Peterson is reportedly living toward inside Mule Creek State Prison. a man holding a conviction he says is false, filing legal challenges from inside the walls, maintaining his innocence to anyone who will listen, and sustaining himself on the vision of a door that under the terms of his sentence does not exist. Life without the possibility of parole does not have a door, it has a wall, and whatever he is envisioning on the other side of it, the sentence he is serving does not contain the mechanism to reach it. Scott Peterson is not passively waiting. In January 2023, the Los Angeles Innocence Project formally took up his case. The Los Angeles Innocence Project is one of the most credentialed wrongful conviction organizations operating in the United States. They do not accept cases as a gesture of goodwill or in response to public pressure. They take cases when their own investigators and attorneys have examined the record and concluded that a genuine, substantiated basis exists for believing a conviction was wrong. When the organization announced it was representing Scott Peterson, it sent a signal that legal analysts, court watchers, and experienced criminal justice journalists recognized immediately. Someone with serious resources and serious credibility had looked at the evidence and decided there was something real worth pursuing. In August 2025, the Los Angeles Innocence Project filed a habeas corpus petition, a formal legal challenge arguing that Peterson had been wrongfully convicted based on what the petition characterized as false scientific evidence. The core of that challenge was a direct attack on the fetal development testimony the prosecution had used at trial to establish the timeline of the case. That testimony was the axis on which the entire prosecution theory rotated. At the 2004 trial, a prosecution expert testified that based on ultrasound analysis drawing on research methodology from 1984, Connor's gestational development placed his time of death on December 23, 2002, the evening before Peterson left for his fishing trip, the evening that Scott and Lacey were home together alone. If Connor died on December 23rd, then Lacey died on December 23rd. And if Lacey died on December 23rd, Peterson's own prior defense attorneys had been candid about what that meant. He was the only person who could have been responsible. The Innocence Project's 2025 petition argued that the science the prosecution had relied upon was not simply dated. It was inaccurate in ways that had direct consequences for the verdict. They presented an analysis by a senior radiologist at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, applying current fetal development methodology, that reached a materially different conclusion. Under that analysis, Connor's likely time of death fell between December 28, 2002 and January 5, 2003. A window of days that opens the timeline significantly. A window that introduces the possibility of alternative suspects. A window that does not place Peterson as the only person who could have been present when Lacey died. The petition also disclosed something that had not previously been part of the public record in this form. The prosecution's own original expert, when interviewed by Innocence Project investigators in 2024, acknowledged that had he applied more recent scientific research methodology, his conclusions about Connor's date of death could have been different. Not would have been, could have been, but the acknowledgement existed in documented form. The expert who had provided the testimony anchoring the prosecution's entire timeline was conceding, 2 decades later, that the methodology he used was not the only methodology available, and that a different approach might have produced a different answer. On April 28, 2026, California Superior Court Judge Elizabeth Hill denied the petition. Her ruling did not engage the scientific arguments on their substantive merits. Instead, she found that the evidence presented was not legally new, that similar arguments had been raised in a 2015 petition, and that because the argument could have been raised at an earlier point in the proceedings, California habeas law barred it from being raised now. The claims were procedurally foreclosed, regardless of their underlying substance. The Los Angeles Innocence Project responded to that ruling directly and without ambiguity. Deputy Director Hannah Brown stated publicly that the organization disagreed with the ruling on every level. She said the court had misapplied the legal standard governing habeas review, and that the correct threshold for that review is not whether evidence is admissible, but whether it is sufficient to undermine confidence in the verdict. Strong exculpatory evidence, the Innocence Project argued, had been turned away at the procedural door before the court ever weighed what it actually contained. They are appealing to a higher court. Peterson also carries a separate legal challenge moving through the California Supreme Court, one focused not on forensic science, but on juror conduct. That appeal centers on juror number 7 from the original trial, a woman named Michelle Juror. Peterson's legal team alleges that she concealed relevant personal history on her juror questionnaire during the selection process. History that, had it been disclosed, would have disqualified her from sitting on the case. The California Supreme Court has not yet issued its ruling on that question. A former federal prosecutor assessing the legal landscape at the close of 2025 described the challenges as real but narrow. He acknowledged the petitions were substantive, but said that overturning a conviction as old, as thoroughly litigated, and as circumstantially grounded as this one required a level of proof the available evidence had not yet reached. That is where the case stands as of 2026. The Innocence Project is in the appeals process following the April ruling. The juror misconduct question is before California's highest court. And Scott Peterson is waking up at Mule Creek State Prison every morning while the legal fight continues outside those walls. He is 53 years old. He has been in custody since April 2003. He has been convicted in a court of law of murdering his pregnant wife and their unborn son. He watched a death sentence get imposed, lived under it for more than 15 years, and then watched it get removed on procedural grounds unrelated to what happened on Covina Avenue in December 2002. He was resentenced to life without parole in December 2021. He was transferred to Mule Creek in October 2022, and on a Sunday morning in March 2025, a man who did not even recognize him beat him in the recreation yard over a pickleball that had rolled loose from the court. When the reporter asked that man to explain it, he said 4 words and moved on. More than 15 years in a 4x10 cell at San Quentin, handcuffed on every movement, invisible to the rest of the facility by institutional design, sealed away from the men who would have known his face and reached their own conclusions about what to do with that knowledge. And then the state of California decided that was the wrong punishment and moved him somewhere with more people, more shared space, more of what his attorney called a normal prison life. On March 9, 2025, on a recreation path at Mule Creek State Prison, normal arrived. 2 people are at the permanent center of this story and have been since Christmas Eve 2002. Lacey Peterson was 27 years old, 8 months pregnant, with a nursery prepared, a name chosen, and a life that was supposed to begin in a fuller way within weeks. Connor Peterson never had the chance to be any age at all. Whatever the courts decide in the months and years ahead, whatever the Innocence Project surfaces through the appeals process, whatever the California Supreme Court concludes about juror conduct, whatever science eventually produces on the question of when Connor died, those 2 facts do not bend. They do not shift under legal argument. They do not move with appellate rulings. Lacey and Connor Peterson are gone. Scott Peterson is at Mule Creek. And on March 9, 2025, according to the man who threw the punches, it was God's plan. When either of the pending legal developments in this case breaks, the Innocence Project's appeal or the California Supreme Court's ruling on juror conduct, the coverage will be here with the same depth and the same precision this story has carried from the beginning. If this investigation reached you, the way these stories are meant to reach people, share it with someone who needs to hear it, not because it is easy to sit with, because the cases that are hardest to process are consistently the ones most worth understanding fully. If you have been watching DAV Crime Records and you have not yet subscribed, do it right now. Every investigation on this channel is built to this standard. The notification bell is the only way to make certain you are there when the next one drops. Subscribe DAV to Crime Records, stay connected to the coverage, and come back for every development in this case as it happens.